My son looked me dead in the eye and said, "Dad, we've talked about this." Like I was a child who'd asked for something unreasonable. Like I'd been running my mouth for 20 minutes and he was tired of it. I'd been talking for maybe 40 seconds. My name is Eugene. I'm 84 years old, and I want to tell you about the day I stopped accepting that. I'm not a dramatic man, never have been. I grew up in a house where men didn't make scenes, didn't raise their voices over things that could be handled with a look. My father used to say more with one silence than most men could say in an hour. I inherited that, wore it like a coat my whole life, and for a long time I thought that coat was armor. Turns out, some of what I thought was dignity was just disappearing quietly. I want to go back to a Tuesday, not a dramatic Tuesday, not the kind with storms or phone calls in the middle of the night, just an ordinary Tuesday in my apartment, the kind that smells like old coffee and whatever the downstairs neighbor is cooking. I had called Marcus, my oldest, called him because I'd been turning something over in my mind for a few days, something about his youngest boy, Elijah, who I'd noticed had gone very quiet at the last family dinner, the kind of quiet I recognized. I wanted to mention it, not make a speech about it, just say, "Keep an eye on him." Marcus picked up on the third ring. I heard keyboard clicking. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" Not a question, a tolerance. I started talking. Got about 4 sentences in, explaining what I'd noticed about Elijah, choosing my words carefully the way I always do. "Dad," he cut right across me. "That's just how he is. He's fine. Was there something else you needed?" Something else I needed. I held the phone for a moment, said no, nothing else. We hung up. I sat in the chair by the window, the one that looks out over the alley, and I thought about what had just happened. What had been happening, actually, for longer than I wanted to admit. Marcus wasn't a bad son. He showed up when things were serious, called on birthdays. If something broke in my apartment and I mentioned it, he'd send someone to fix it within a week. By any reasonable measure, he was doing his job, the filial duties, the visible ones. But somewhere along the way, I couldn't tell you exactly when, I had become a thing to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. My observations were inconveniences. My memories were interruptions. My attempts at conversation were something to be deflected efficiently so we could both get on with our days. And the hardest part was that I had let it happen. Not all at once, slowly, the way water cuts through stone. Every time I let the cut remark pass without comment. Every time I shortened what I was saying because I could feel him half listening. Every time I hung up and told myself it wasn't worth making a thing of. I had trained him, without meaning to, that I would absorb it. My first instinct, sitting in that chair, was the one I'd always had. Say nothing. Keep the peace. He's busy. He doesn't mean it. This is what I'd done for years, probably since his childhood, if I'm honest. I was the wall. Walls don't complain. Walls absorb. But I was 84 years old and I was sitting in a chair by an alley window after a 40-second phone call in which I had been dismissed like a minor inconvenience. And something in me, very quietly, with no drama, refused. Not rage, nothing like that, just a refusal. Like a door that had been left open for years finally, gently, swinging shut. I tried the obvious things first. The next time Marcus called, about 2 weeks later, I said something. Told him that I'd felt cut off on our last call. Said it plainly, the way I try to say most things. He went quiet for a moment and then said, in a careful voice, "Dad, I wasn't trying to cut you off. I was in the middle of something." And I said I understood that. And he said, "I'll try to be more mindful." And I said, "I appreciate that." And within 3 calls, we were right back where we'd started. Nothing had changed. Because what I'd done wasn't really a confrontation, it was a complaint. And complaints, in my experience, are easy to absorb and easier to forget. So I tried another approach. I stopped reaching out as much. Thought that if I gave him silence, he'd notice the silence. Give him something to miss. I went about 3 weeks without calling first. He called twice. both times about logistics. Once about a family event he needed to know if I was attending. Once about whether I'd found a new doctor since my old one retired. Both conversations lasted under 5 minutes. When I finally called him at the end of those 3 weeks, his voice carried no particular awareness that anything had been different. Just, "Hey Dad, what's up?" Same tone, same briskness. Withdrawal hadn't worked either. Because the relationship I thought I was withholding, the relationship where he noticed my absence and felt it, that relationship didn't seem to exist in the form I'd imagined. He wasn't pining, he was just busy, and the withdrawal didn't cost him anything he'd been spending. So there I was, 2 attempts, both failures, and a slow, uncomfortable realization that I had been operating on a set of assumptions that no longer applied, if they ever had. This is going to sound strange, but the thing that finally got through to me came from a boy named Lucas. He's 11, lives in the building with his father, visits on weekends, quiet kid, watchful. He doesn't have what I'd call a lot of manners in the formal sense, but he has something better, attention. When he asks me something, he actually waits for the answer, doesn't fill the silence, doesn't look at anything else. One Saturday afternoon, he knocked on my door because his father had asked him to return a wrench I'd lent down. He handed it over and then, for some reason, didn't immediately leave. Just stood there, looking at a framed photograph on the shelf near the door. It's an old one, Lorraine and me, somewhere in the early 70s, outside a building I can barely remember. He said, "Is that you?" I said it was. He looked at it for another moment and said, "You look like you're about to say something." I looked at the photograph. I hadn't really studied it in years. He was right. There was something in my expression, younger me, standing with my arm around Lorraine, that looked like a man about to speak. Not anxious, not uncertain, just ready. I don't know if he understood what he'd done. I don't think he did. He handed me the wrench, said, "Sue Eugene," the way he always does, and went back downstairs. But I stood there in my doorway for a long minute, looking at that photograph, at the man in it, who didn't ask permission to take up space in a conversation, who didn't preemptively shrink. Something started working itself out in my mind. The next time Marcus called, I let the conversation go normally for a while. He was talking about work, about a project, about something with one of his kids at school. I was listening, making the appropriate sounds, being a good audience. And then there was a natural pause, and I started talking. I got maybe 2 sentences in, something about a memory I had of taking Marcus to his first real job interview, how nervous he'd been, how I'd driven around the block twice to give him time to collect himself. And I heard him pick something up, paper shuffling, the unmistakable rustle of a man doing something else. Old Eugene would have wrapped it up, said something like, "Anyway," cleared his throat, moved toward a closing. Instead, I stopped. Not dramatically, I just stopped talking, mid-thought. The silence stretched. After a moment, Marcus said, "Sorry, what was that?" And I said, calmly, without any edge in it, "I was sharing something with you. When you started doing something else, I stopped. I'd like you to actually be here for this." Silence again, longer this time. He said, "You're right, I'm sorry, I'm listening." And I finished the story. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened after that, because it wasn't a transformation. It wasn't some breakthrough where Marcus suddenly became a different person. He's still busy. He still has 40 things in his head during most of our calls. But something had shifted, not in him, not yet, but in me. I had stopped the conversation at the point where it stopped being a conversation. And because I'd done it without accusation, without making him into a villain, without listing his failures as a son, because I just named what was happening and asked for something specific, he'd had nothing to deflect. There was no attack to defend against, just a quiet, plain statement and a request. "I was sharing something with you. I'd like you to actually be here for this." I started paying attention to the moments, all the small ones I'd been letting slide. The time he used that tone, the one that comes out when he thinks I'm being slow or repetitive. And instead of swallowing it, I said, "The way you just said that felt impatient. I need you to try that again." Not with anger, with the same steadiness I'd have used to tell him the weather. He looked startled the first time I said something like that in person. We were at a family dinner. I believe it was at his place, the dining room they never use except for occasions, and I'd said something about how a street I remembered used to look different. He cut me off with something like, "Dad, that was 40 years ago." Dismissive, not cruel, but dismissive. And the whole table went quiet, the way tables do. I looked at him and said, "That matters to me. I'd like you to let me finish." His wife quietly said, "Go ahead, Eugene." He nodded, said, "You're right, sorry," and I continued. What I noticed, and this took me by surprise, was that saying these things didn't create the conflict I'd always expected. My whole life I'd held back corrections because I thought they would lead to arguments, to resentment, to that particular silence that meant someone was keeping score. But the corrections I was making weren't attacks. They weren't comparisons. They weren't histories. They were just specific, quiet redirections at the moment of the thing. I was sharing something. "I'd like you to be here." "The way you said that felt impatient. Try that again." "That matters to me. Let me finish." Nothing to argue with, no character assassination, just a fact about the moment and a direction. I'll tell you something that I wasn't prepared for. After about 2 months of this, 2 months of small corrections, quiet and consistent, without apology, Marcus called me on a Sunday. Not about logistics, not about an event or a favor. He called and said, "Hey, Dad, I was just thinking about you." We talked for 40 minutes. He asked me questions, real ones, about my life before he was born, about his grandfather, about what it was like working in a place that didn't treat you as more than your function. He listened to the answers. At the end, he said something that I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "I like talking to you." I said I liked talking to him too, and I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean it in years. He said, "I think I forgot who you were. Like, outside of being my dad, you became just the thing I was responsible for. And then you stopped accepting that, and I started actually seeing you again." He didn't say it like an apology exactly. He said it more like a realization out loud. And I received it the same way. I didn't say, "It's all right," and I didn't say, "I knew you'd come around." I just said, "I'm still here." What I understand now that I didn't understand then is that I had been operating on a certain logic for most of my life. The logic said, "Do not make demands. Do not impose. Make yourself convenient. Love the people around you by making sure your presence never costs them anything. Be easy." I thought that was grace. I think now it was closer to erasure. Because the thing about never asking to be treated a particular way is that you leave the other person with no information. They don't know what you need. They fill in the blank themselves. And usually, if someone can treat you like an interruption and there are no consequences, they eventually treat you like an interruption out of habit, not malice, habit. The words, "I was sharing something. I'd like you to actually be here for this." They worked not because they were magic, and not because Marcus was afraid of them. They worked because they were specific. They named the moment. They asked for a specific adjustment. They gave him something concrete to respond to, rather than a general charge of inadequacy. You can't defend against "you were doing something else while I was talking." It's either true or it isn't. And if you say it without fury, without history, without making it a referendum on your entire relationship, just the moment, just this, then there's nothing to escalate into. There's only the question of whether the person is willing to adjust. Usually, they are. I'm grateful for that photograph by the door, the one Lucas noticed. I look at it sometimes in the mornings, early, before the building gets noisy. The man in it didn't know what was coming, didn't know about the years of accumulated quiet, the swallowed corrections, the conversations he'd shorten because he could feel the other person was only half listening, didn't know that the discipline he'd spent his life practicing, the composure, the even-keeledness, the refusal to make a scene, would sometimes get used against him in the form of an assumption that he didn't need much, didn't want much, was fine. But he looks like he's about to say something, and I think he would have said it plainly, without apology. I think somewhere under all the training, all the years of learning to be convenient, that man still knew that he was worth talking to. It took me until 84 to fully agree with him. I'm grateful for that. Grateful even for the Tuesday by the alley window, and the 40-second phone call, and the refusal that grew out of it. Grateful for the quiet that followed after, and what grew in the quiet. For every ordinary Sunday conversation that felt, finally, like two people in the same room. If you've been sitting with me today, thank you, truly. I don't take the company lightly. If something here landed somewhere inside you, I hope you carry it gently. And if you want to come back and sit with me again, I'll be here. Just press that little button down there that says subscribe. That's all it takes. I'll be waiting. Take care of yourself.